the usurers, and it goes back to the biblical times. This marvelous book by Michael Hudson shows that debt was automatically cancelled in the 7th year of any regime from 2400 BC in Lagash in Sumeria. This is the first debt cancellation of 2400 BC. It then continued from Hammurabi and etc. all the way to the biblical period. And the Mosaic Law cancels the debt in the 7th year. It is never allowed to exceed 7 years. If you try and fold a piece of paper, you cannot fold it more than 7 times. So it's showing you something, that debt, but preferably, and this was the idea, the Quranic idea, is better still to forgive the debt if you were compos mentis, as my mother says. Now, the solution to the problem of that, as I showed, now this is 1795. This was when the Napoleonic War broke out, everyone was in a similar state to today. Now, the Liverpool Corporation then came and got an Act of Parliament, or got an act passed, where they would issue Liverpool's own local money. And they did this, and they solved the problem, and that is then again, now Cameron is calling for each community to be independent. Right, let's see if he'll allow any community to issue its own money, any corporation to issue its own money, because that we can solve everything within 24, 48, 72 hours. But that's a precedent, and it's on statute. Okay? There is also currently going through an EDM. This is the Bank of England Creation and Currency Bill. That's 2010. And that's Ben Dyson. He is very much active in that. He was going to come tonight. Oh, Ben. Oh, you're there. Sorry, Ben. I didn't see you there. But there, Ben. That's something that is now current and very important, that we actually see that. Now, there have been moves before to get this actually put on statute. And an EDM was done in 1964 by Captain Henry Kirby. And he called then for the omission of all means, that this House considered the means of exchange, that the Queen and the Crown is restored its right to create all the money that we require as a nation, and that's what we should do. But in 1823 we have here the actual plan by David Ricardo for the National Bank of England. This was to replace the Bank of England, which, as we know, is a private company, has operated and functioned entirely for private ends. And from Robert Owen, who couldn't be here tonight, he tells us that the Bank of England is actually now a Bowen. It's Bank of England nominees. It's a £100 company with 2 shares issued. That is the situation with the Bank of England today. Okay, right. I mentioned the Liverpool thing and Napoleon. This book is Napoleon and Islam, and it is a translation done by James Gibb-Stuart from the French into the English. I'm going to plan to republish both the English translation. And the Battle of Waterloo was the fact that he had abolished interest in as the basis of French debt. The Battle of Waterloo drew out all the heads of state that the Bank of England ordered to fight Napoleon, and also to create skirmishes to split him and divide him. But when you read what actually Napoleon was about, particularly his letter to Tipu Sultan, anybody from the subcontinent, he writes to Tipu Sultan while he's in Cairo. You have already been informed of my arrival on the shores of the Red Sea, filled with the desire to free you from the iron yoke of England. And this is the correspondent. Please send someone to Greater Cairo with whom I can negotiate. So that was his view. But also his meeting with Goethe. He has lunch with Goethe, and they discuss Voltaire's Mohammed, the play that he wrote. But also Goethe and Napoleon both converted to Islam, which brings us to the very important reason why the Battle of Waterloo was his abolition of interest based on common sense. It wasn't based on religious view, it was based on common sense. And so the Battle of Waterloo, unfortunately Napoleon lost, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here today having this conversation. We wouldn't be talking at the Bank of England, it would be a public bank, and we would have had an entirely different situation. But about the same time, Thomas Jefferson wrote this. In his letters, you really must read Jefferson as monetary reformers. Because in the past 994 years, all the problems that we're seeing were warned by him. He said, the modern theory for the perpetuation of debts has drenched the earth with blood and crushed its inhabitants under burdens ever accumulating. Peter, he said, with the decline of society begins indeed, bellum omnium in omnia, war of all against all, which some philosophers, observing to be so general in this world, have mistaken it for the natural instead of the abusive state of man. And the forehorse of this frightful team is public debt. Taxation follows that. And in its train, the wretchedness and oppression. And that was in his letter to Samuel Kershwell in 1816, echoing Benjamin Franklin's earlier warnings that in this world nothing is certain but death and taxes. The burden of debt is as destructive to freedom as subjugation by conquest. Jefferson then went on to state, this is the tendency of all human governments. A departure from principle in one instance becomes a precedent for a second, that second for a third, and so on till the bulk of society is reduced to become mere automatons of misery, to have no sensibilities left but for sinning and suffering. If the American people ever allow banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continents their fathers conquered. The issuing of money should be replaced, taken from the banks and restored to Congress and the people to whom it properly belongs. And then he quotes the modern, this was from Jefferson, it wasn't from Franklin. But here, this is the situation that the Americans, and Lincoln, of course, his monetary policy is exquisite. Of course, they shot him 3 days later, which is why probably Cameron and Clegg might not challenge the banks at this particular moment. But however, it's something that, as we discussed, Jesus walked on water, fed the 5,000. He found himself in serious difficulty when he overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. Now, the problem about this situation with the banks and the power of the banks, where we've heard all the awful things from Blankfein and all these characters, awful, living on increment of the same people. But this was from the Bankers Association in 1894, and this was a memo, and it was read out to the American Congress in the record of April 29, 1913, 1894. On September 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possessions. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and thousands of them to the east at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants as in England. That was the American Bankers Association, 1891. So can anybody tell me, we've got 5 minutes, right, that things have improved? No, because we the people, or we the sheeple, we haven't really challenged things now. The fact is that it is a game that's rerun, and I can quote you from Benjamin Friedman, saying that the depression of the 29th to 30s was created by the Federal Reserve, which withdrew 1/3 of all money in circulation between 1929 and 1933. This was the cause of the depression. Now, what's interesting, not far away from here, in 2004, Gordon Brown addressed a spending review committee, and this is from David Blunkett's diary in 2004. Excuse me. He said, and so to special cabinet. Prior to the spending review announcement on Wednesday morning, Gordon was extremely friendly and talked very positively about the Home Office and me. He painted a picture of what was going to happen from 2008 onwards, of 1.9% average growth, how dreadful things were going to be, and how everybody needed to wind down what they were going to do. I just couldn't resist putting my hand on his shoulder and saying, I'm surprised you really want to continue being Chancellor with such a dreadful scenario. There was utter silence. I could feel jaws dropping, and then everybody started to laugh. When I saw Tony Blair afterwards for a private meeting, he said, only you could have got away with that. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I